project, and they had actually gone through this experience where they actually decided they never wanted to repeat again. Okay, they estimated, and this was where they were developing some custom hardware as well as developing software. So they went through this estimation. They estimated the hardware was going to take them about 1 year. They estimated the software, and they decided the software was going to take them 16 weeks. Okay, so that was their estimate. They were seasoned developers. Of course, it was a brand new product. As it turned out, amazingly enough, the hardware did take 1 year. Any guesses on the software? 2 years. Okay, so they were quite a bit off. So they swore, this is not what we're going to do again. So what they did is when they went over to this new project, and this was a brand new project, okay, something that people had never done before. They estimated the whole project at 18 months. Okay, and amazingly enough, guess how long it took them? 18 months. And now, any guess at what software development lifecycle they used? Anybody? Any other guesses? Okay, well, the first comment won, waterfall. Okay, so there's nothing wrong with waterfall, but, okay, and there's a but, and I'll use that several times in this discussion. Things have changed. There were a couple of things that were working for them at the time that most organizations do not have right now. One of the number one items is change. They had the luxury of specifying a product about 1.5 years in advance and delivering what they specified 1.5 years ago. Okay, I don't know how many of you have been through that experience, but I would say that that's a really small number of projects that can actually do that these days. Okay, there are some number of other things. Some of them were based on necessity. They were building this product in ROM. Okay, you really couldn't change it once you were done. Okay, so they really didn't have the luxury of putting this thing out, okay, and then changing it when the customers gave them feedback. Okay, so there are other things that you would argue that probably waterfall is a fine process. Okay, now what I'm going to be talking about, okay, is Agile, but I'm not going to be repeating all the things that many of you already know, which are all the practices and principles and ceremonies, except for one slide, that you probably have already gone through. Okay, focus on the underlying concepts, because one of the things that you may have come to the conclusion yourself is that a one process fits all is hard to do. And one of the problems, one of the main impediments that organizations have in terms of deploying a new software development lifecycle or any development lifecycle, it doesn't necessarily even need to be software, is resistance to change. Okay? There are some things that people say, no, I'm not doing this. So if you basically come in there with this book of things that you will be doing, all these things, many of which you've never been doing before, you're likely to get a lot of resistance. Okay? So the idea is if you're deploying methodology into the organization is to be somewhat agile, being able to change things to fit your environment and your needs. Okay? And that's really going to be the focus of this talk, is focusing on some of the core concepts of Agile. Okay? And these are the things, and you choose in your own organizations how do you want to deploy them. Okay? So a couple of things on this talk. I like interaction. Okay? So questions are welcome at any time. Okay? If anything you don't understand or anything I don't understand, please just speak up. So with that, I'm going to change to first is a question. Okay? Just shout out or in some orderly fashion. What do you think are the main impediments in your own experience? Impediments affecting quality and productivity. Any? Okay, resources. Any others? Changing requirements? Lack of cooperation. People don't sort of want to cooperate or they just don't? Collaboration. Okay. Anyone else? Everybody else perfectly run projects, right? People just don't know what they want. Okay. Communication. Scope. Scope as in changing scope. Okay. Budget. Okay. Doing too many different things. Okay. I've never had that. Any others? Okay. So I just threw down some, and obviously these are all good. One of the ones that I really didn't hear was distractions, though someone sort of hinted at that. Is people do really well when they focus, but nowadays, especially with all the different ways of actually getting to the people who are working on any project, distractions are a big one. And you'll actually see a related one at the end that I came up with. Changes, obviously, people clearly identified changes, lack of communication, right? These are things, and multitasking. Is anybody believe that multitasking is actually efficient? Yeah, well, all the Agile folks will tell you no way, no how, and I'd probably say that most people have the same experience. Is multitasking is really bad. So when you walk into a meeting and everybody has their laptop sitting there doing their email, you can be pretty much assured that at any given point in time, almost no one's listening. Okay, and they're certainly not putting their energy into whatever it is that you're trying to achieve at the meeting. So multitasking is, I would suggest, be really sensitive to multitasking because it's not, okay? If nothing else, they're focused on something else and not what you're doing or whatever the meeting's about. But the other thing to keep it in mind is, and this comes down to one of the core concepts of Agile, is Agile is focused on maintaining focus, okay? So now a lot of people say, no, 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 we should be able to do 10 things at the same time. Bottom line, all the literature out there says no way, no how, okay? You're much more efficient if you can get focus. So that, oh, another one, specialists, okay? Specialists are, think about it this way. If you're a project manager and you look at it and you have all these resources that specialize in one thing, or even two things, it makes it really hard to load balance, right? Because not every project you work with is going to need the same recipe in terms of skills, okay? And there are many different reasons why you'll run into the same problem. Whereas before you have these specialists, one is it makes it really hard to actually keep things aligned, but the other thing you'll see is when we get into work in progress, it makes it really difficult to not generate a lot of work in progress. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So I'm going to change slides to maturity. Have any of you read the book Twice the Productivity in Half the Time? No, not really? Okay. It's anyway, right? The budget allocation? Okay, thank you. I'll have to pay attention to that. Okay, so in there, it talks about, and I'll go through it, is anybody know Aikido? It's a martial art, sort of. Okay, so people know it. Actually, there's a core concept in Aikido. And what they do is, there are 3 levels of proficiency, okay, that they talk about. There are lots of belts and dans and things like that. But there are 3 levels of proficiency. There's the shu level, where you basically do everything the sensei tells you exactly how the sensei tells you, okay? Do not deviate. This is how you're going to learn it, and you do it over and over and over and over again, and eventually you can get really good and you achieve the next level, which is hot. At the hot level, at this point, what you are allowed to do is innovate. So not every punch is going to be thrown at you the same way. You're able to do things a little bit differently because you have that basis, that proficiency, that allows you to actually change the style to meet the changing environment. Okay, and the final layer is where you basically just throw all that away and you do what makes sense. Okay, because now you're so proficient, okay, you know what's right to do. Okay, we're coming back to this discussion, okay, we're going to ignore shu at all, totally, okay, for the following reason, not because it doesn't make sense, but because it doesn't make sense, is if you were to follow, coming back to the beginning when I was talking, okay, is if you do everything exactly the way the book tells you to do, chances are they're going to be people going to check out. Okay, this doesn't make sense. They don't have, why would I be doing this? Why do I have to meet 5 times a week for a stand-up? Okay, 1 time a week was always good enough, right? Why do I have to work on these stories? Why can't I do 5 things at a time? I finished this, let me go off to this. The idea is if you do it exactly the way the Scrum book tells you, you're going to hit a lot of resistance, okay? Now, of course, the Agile community is going to tell you, do exactly that, okay? But you make that decision. What I'd like to do is actually get you somewhere to the second, okay? where you decide what makes sense for your environment, okay? And the way I'm going to do that is talk to you about some of the underlying concepts that you should be looking for, okay? And trying to avoid, okay? So I'm going to change the next is Agile with Scrum. So just another show of hands. How many people actually would say that they are proficient with Agile practices? Okay, a few people. How many would say that they have a moderate amount of familiarity? A lot more people. Okay, how many have heard the term Agile? Okay, so the Agile Manifesto, which I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, but I am going to use it to give you another story, okay? One of the times in my life, I decided CMMI was this great new process. Everybody know CMMI? Some people know CMMI. Made Watts Humphrey a lot of money, I think. So I was a CMMI appraiser. So I would go into a project. Now, I was not the lead appraiser. I was just an assistant appraiser. I would go in and I would actually evaluate specific aspects of the project. Now, there are certain things in PMP would love this. They're very disciplined in terms of what they're expecting and how you document everything. So some of the key things that you look for when you're appraising a project and whether or not they have reached a particular maturity level and hit a particular key process area is that you look for an artifact and you look for something that validates the artifact. So for example, in the story I'm going to use is it's required to show proficiency in risk management that you have a risk management process, okay? And that you can actually demonstrate, okay, through an artifact, actually I think it's 2 artifacts, that you actually are following that process, okay? So I was praising this one project and they certainly put up this document that said, here's our risk management process. And then they showed up a set of meeting notes that said, see, we reviewed the risk management process. So this particular project was about 6 months, okay? They blew their end date by about 3 months. Okay, so their 6-month project took 9 months, okay? The things that actually killed it or sort of delayed the project were really evident not only at the start of the project, but actually a month into the project. It was clear that this thing was not going to make its objectives very early, okay? Do you think that risk management plan changed at all? Not a word, okay? So they had this great process on how they were going to change their risk management process, okay? But they didn't do it. Even though they had an artifact that said that they did at least review it, they really weren't doing risk management. So I went to the lead appraiser and I said, look, I'd like to fail them on this, okay? They clearly are not doing risk management. And the lead appraiser said, did they have the artifact? Yes. Did they have the validation that they followed the artifact? Yes. You have to pass them. That is not Agile, okay? Agile, you do what makes sense, okay? You do the things that will actually drive value to your projects, okay? Not because someone is telling you what to do, okay? And that's one of the things in terms of if you look at the manifesto, they're valuing, okay, what the individuals bring to the team. If the individuals as a team decide that this is the best way to do it, you really got to listen to them, okay? Not because there's a process that says you need to do A, B, and C in this order, okay? So with that, I'm really not going to go through the rest of it. I'm sure most of you have already seen it. But now the next thing, everybody okay with that? Does that make sense? Okay? Now, of course, I'll take a shot here. In terms of the one thing about the Agile community is they really do have processes and they really do want you to follow them. And I might be saying heresy by saying, sort of fudge it. But again, I think as a practical matter, it is much more effective if you do what makes sense rather than because there's something that's telling you do this. Okay? Everybody okay with that? Some people okay with that? Yeah, go ahead.
So that an Agile team has to be process oriented. But it doesn't mean they have to do it because that's what it is. So I think that you're right, but let's be pro process that.
And that's a good point. Okay, so the question was, okay, it actually is more of a comment than it was a question. I get some feedback here. Can you keep talking? Oh, sorry on the bridge. I don't know if you guys can hear this, but everything's echoed.
If you could just summarize what you said.
Okay, well, I was getting there. The comment was that this is not a free-for-all, okay? There needs to be an agreed upon way that the team members interact, not only within a team, but also external to the team, which you didn't say, but I'll add to it, okay? And I'm going to say that I totally agree with that. And if you look at the Agile beginnings and way people viewed Agile, okay, it was framed as, and especially in the software context, of what do software developers like to do? They like to write software. So Agile is an excuse to not write documents, okay? So basically it was a free-for-all. Everybody write software for whatever you think the project's supposed to do, rather than sort of actually having some structure around it. And the same goes through for communication. The same goes through in terms of interactions. You have to have an agreement in terms of how people are going to interact and how teams are going to interact. And the follow-on part of that comment was, that doesn't mean you're doing it because there's a document that tells you to do it this way. You're doing it because that's what the team feels is the most effective way to achieve it. Did I capture it? Okay, in the back.
Come to the microphone, please, so we can hear you.
I think I heard the question.
Why you would have failed that risk management team?
Why would have failed the risk management team? Because they weren't doing what they said they were going to do, okay? Which is manage risks. So the risk management as part of the plan that they put together, they had a plan that said that they were going to review risks, okay, on an ongoing basis. And as new risks came up or became evident, they would basically put that into the plan. They would figure out whether or not they were going to accept the risk, mitigate the risk, take some sort of preemptory approach to it. That was sort of the things that would come out of that risk management plan, okay? And they would actually meet, but the risks were really evident as they were going along, and they weren't doing that. The same risks that they were seeing at the end of that they had documented at the end of the project, that's basically caused the project to overrun its objectives, were the same risks that they had actually put at the beginning of the project. So they were not doing risk management. They said they were doing risk management, but they weren't doing it, okay? It's a difference between focusing on, I'm gonna create a document that no one ever reads or follows. That is specifically what Agile, as a core belief, is saying, don't do, okay? If you're gonna document something, or even if you're not gonna document something, that says, this is a practice that we're going to follow, you do it because you're actually going to follow it, okay? And the other nice thing, which, sorry, I'm taking shots at CMMI, I apologize, is you don't get a grade, okay? The thing about Agile, and if you look back, right, is it's working software is your grade. Or in this case, take out the software. I know a lot of you aren't actually in software. Whatever it is that your objective is for that Agile team, that's what counts, not whether or not you achieve maturity level 3, okay? So it's coming back to do something that makes sense. Now, maybe I'm turning some people off here, but, and I apologize. I don't mean to make far-reaching statements because every situation is unique. And again, do what makes sense, right? Other questions, comments? Is that okay? Okay, change. Now, change came up at the beginning as something that's fairly common problem, right? Impediment, right? So I know in our organization at times, in many organizations, the idea is what you do is you put up barriers to change. It's like, no, let me finish this and then I'll get to that, okay? Or no, you can't change this because then we're not gonna be able to deliver when we said we would deliver, okay? So, but the problem is, oh, sorry, let me go back into change. Change is inefficient. Everybody would agree with that? Anybody disagree with that? No? Yeah, change is inefficient. If you could actually have the same objectives, everything's the same as you move along, it's going to be really efficient, in which case probably you don't really need to follow Agile. But it is inefficient. It does delay is if you had change as opposed to no change, it will make things go slower, right? It will increase your costs. That's just a matter of fact of change, okay? And also, yeah, change, you basically came in, you developed something or you did something and now you changed it. Of course, it's going to impact the quality, right? Or you may take a lot of time to actually try to get back to where you were. Okay, so it does impact quality. So what's the answer? Is the answer that you basically avoid change? Well, I think most of you probably have the experiences you can't. That is a fact of life in most organizations this way. Change is going to happen. So you can either try to do your best to basically just push it off and ignore it, or you could embrace it. Okay, and that again is a core concept of Agile. Is don't try to take the position of I'll deal with change if it comes. It will come. It will happen. You actually have to structure your processes and the way you work so that you're embracing change. You're expecting it to happen, and you're going to do things in a way that sort of make it so that those 4 items and any others that are important to you have minimal impact on ultimately the outcome of what you're doing. So coming to that, and that is a core fundamental belief of Agile or focus of Agile, is embrace change. Accept it, it will happen. Now figure out how to deal with it. Okay? At the front end, not later. Okay with that? Any questions? Okay, next slide is work in progress. Okay, so starting with work in progress. Anybody hear of Tom Peters? Yeah, some people. Yeah, Tom Peters, he was a guru, very energetic speaker. He used to talk about different quality things that would occur at companies, usually success stories, but he usually start off with a disaster. So I'm going to ask you to do something to visualize one of these. I'll call it a disaster. Anybody here have a Harley Davidson motorcycle? Everybody know what a Harley Davidson is? Okay, so one of Tom Peters' stories is about Harley Davidson, the factory, okay? And he starts off the story talking about, you walk into any Harley Davidson showroom, and I think this was back in the 80s, early 80s, and what do you see under each bike? Any guesses? What's that? Yeah, piece of cardboard, okay? So you have this brand new Harley Davidson bike, and they weren't cheap, with a piece of cardboard underneath. Why? To catch the oil leaks. Okay? So the idea was good. They went back into the production facility to find out why all these brand new bikes all leaked oil. And Harley Davidson at the time had this, I'll use my words, he may not have used it that way, had this state-of-the-art production facility where basically they would produce things at one workstation and they would stick it on a rack. And the rack would take it up to the ceiling, okay, and then would go down to the next workstation. Now, the problem with this was that at times you might have 3 or more months of work in progress sitting on the ceiling, okay? So imagine the following, okay? You have someone who's doing an engine assembly, putting it together, it gets into the next station a couple of months later. They look and they decide something's a mil off. They look up the ceiling, they look at the product, they look at the ceiling, they look at the product, and they say, oops, I think I'm just going to stick it in and go on, okay? So what's the basic problem with that? The problem with that is you have all this work in progress that's sitting there, okay, that you've spent money on, and you don't want to throw away, okay? So one of the core concepts I'm going to talk to you about is minimize work in progress, okay? Now, one of the things I meant to say at the beginning, I should have backed up on, is while I come from a software background, Agile as a life cycle, okay, or as a methodology, is being used by organizations way outside of software, okay? Software fits nicely, but is by no means, okay, the only application of Agile. So I've sort of sat recently through a presentation where it was a Department of Public Works. The people who repair potholes were doing Agile, okay? And they were talking about it as a success story. So clearly it worked for them, and it made sense. Again, when you look at some of these core concepts, the things that I'm talking about as core concepts are just as applicable for the Department of Public Works as it is for software, okay? So please don't look at Agile as purely a software thing, even though 90% of what you'll hear is about software. Okay, so anyway, so everybody have that visualization in their mind? Now I took that detour? Okay, so minimize work in progress. Okay, communicate, so we'll come back to most of these later. Okay, communicate, collaborate, focus. Okay, and I'm changing slides to waterfall. Okay, everybody knows what waterfall is. Well, most of you probably know what waterfall is, again, if you're in software. Right, so what's the typical waterfall process? You identify all the features in the release. Okay, you develop the requirements. I don't mean to talk slow. Develop requirements, you implement it, right? You test, you fix it, and at any given point, you might have to back up the waterfall, right? Retest and deliver, okay? And I'm sure some of you, if not many of you, have been in projects where you've developed all the requirements and then something changes. Oops, we developed the requirements for the wrong thing, okay? So what do you do with those requirements? Oh, you throw them out. Those requirements are a work in progress, okay? You've spent a lot of time working, developing something that you're just going to throw away, okay? And you got nothing for it. And you can look at it almost any step, because the problem with the waterfall process in general, as a pure process, is you really have nothing until you're done. Nothing, right? So, but most organizations are really smart, okay? They're not dumb, okay? They don't follow waterfall this way. They actually will do something sort of like this, okay? And there are lots of ways to do it, right? Where you're following a concurrent waterfall process, where basically you are sort of dividing things into features and functionality and you're delivering them in pieces, okay? But one of the problems here, remember I said back on the beginning about specialists? Okay, one of the problems when you look at a process like this, and if you look at what I have on the slides, is you have people who are specialists, who are basically going to go along this specialty area until they run out of work, okay, until they finish something, and then they're going to do the next thing in their specialty area. Problem is that makes it rather difficult. Okay, and now start talking about some of the things that you may have experienced relative to doing something like this. Now, for the first arrow that I have here, probably not a big problem as long as everybody's on board. You generate a set of requirements for the first feature. Now, the problem is if all these people are off doing something else, they're off on another project, are you going to get their mind share in terms of actually providing meaningful feedback on those requirements? Maybe, maybe not, right? What about here? Is now you have an analyst who's generating requirements for feature 2, but everybody else is in the middle of developing feature 1. So where's their head? It's in feature 1. So basically, what's that going to generate? It's going to generate rework, because what's going to happen is, yeah, it looks good. They have no reason. They might think a little bit ahead, think about some of the issues that they might come up with, and look back and say, yeah, that doesn't look right. But more in general, for the most part, you're only going to get a small fraction of the feedback that you could if everybody's head was really centered around the feature functionality that they were developing at the time, right? People sort of agree with that? So again, there's a couple of things here. One is the focus, right? Alignment, focus. Now what happens is, go ahead, say developer 1, feature 2 depends on developer 2 changes. Now this comes into something different. So developer 1 in this slide is basically off on feature 2, okay? But all the other developers, all the other members of his team, so to speak, are off developing feature 1, okay? But they're stuck because they required some feature 2 changes from some other developer. So what do they do at this point? They can go off and have coffee for a long time. They could actually start on feature 3. Yeah, no one would ever do that, right? But the problem is going to be with this kind of approach is that developer is basically stuck, okay? And one of the things they may do is then try to say reprioritize developers 2 work, put whatever they're in on hold, bring back in the thing that developer 1 now goes, but now you had developer 3 who's depending on developer 2, and they're now actually stuck, okay? So you basically end up in a situation where you're sort of running ad hoc, okay? Where you can either be really inefficient or really inefficient, so what do you do? So you try to make the best decision at the time, but again, so, okay, feature 1 has test issues. Now all these guys are off on feature 2. Now all of a sudden you have a validation team who's validating stuff. They find issues. What's going to happen? Well, the guys who are back on feature 1 are basically going to have to make all these changes and stop what they're doing. Remember that whole focus thing? Yeah, not. And unless, of course, you deliver everything perfectly, and that always happens. So we go on. Oh, guess what happened? Feature 3 is deleted. Well, guess we're going to throw out some work in progress on that. Actually, developer 1 requirements in this example, right? And so you look at these kinds of, and I'm sure you've all had your own examples. But the point of this whole thing is, if you follow a process like this, and there's a couple of things that you have to look at. One of the key ones is specialization, okay? If people are basically going to just run as fast as possible in their specialty, it basically will get to a process like this, okay? And that's a problem because not everybody can do everything. There are things that you have to specialize. Agile has a term in terms of what they've, has anybody ever heard the term generalized specialist? You tell me no one's ever heard that? Okay, well, at least, okay, a few people have heard it. Generalized specialist is basically the Agile community sort of admitting that you have to have specialists. But the idea is that over time, what you want to do is you want to broaden the scope of the people in the team, okay? So if you have, and you'll see why this is evident in a minute, how this works. If you have developer 1 is done, rather than having developer 1 go off to feature 2, developer 1 basically comes back in and spends time on feature 1. And it may not be in the area they're specialized in. It may be in some other area that they might have some inclination in. Maybe they test it. Maybe they get coffee for the second developer. Who knows? But the idea is that they're trying to expand their knowledge and help complete feature 1 rather than moving off onto feature 2. Okay? So there's a couple of things part of that, but one of them is to broaden the scope of knowledge and the ability for that developer to contribute, okay, in other areas. Because remember what we said at the very beginning. If you can broaden the scope of what people can contribute, it makes the load balancing a lot easier, okay? And as we'll get into the next slide, you'll see how that helps, okay? Yeah, everybody knows the 80-20 rule. Okay, so Agile. Okay, so one of the things that anybody who's done Agile probably has heard. Now, many people call them stories. Well, that's what Agile calls them, or at least Scrum calls them. I like calling them vertical slices. And I think we was in the business analyst presentation, we were talking about this vertical slices. The idea about vertical slices, okay, whereas before you looked at your specialization, right? If you had different areas, called a UI developer, called a database developer, right? Is they basically have these specialties and you're going across, okay? The idea with vertical slices is to make them vertically from requirements all the way through to test, okay? So the idea is, and if you look at a number of these, okay, together, now you get into things where a sprint. The idea is to deliver these things by the time you finish the sprint. You have all the requirements development, you have all the implementation, everything's tested, right? And this is what we were talking about before, is where if developer 1 finished up on a particular story, or maybe they work 2 stories concurrently, right? Then, and they're done, they basically go off and they do something else. They basically help out in some other area. And initially, they may be really inefficient of doing this. But the idea is, you're in here for the long game, is over time, that developer will become much more proficient in a broader area, okay? So therefore, it'll become much more doable to actually achieve this, okay? And that's actually something that kills a lot of Agile projects at the beginning. If you look at the end game and you say, I should be able to do all these things that when I first bring up Agile, it's not gonna happen. And a lot of times what will happen is the organization will try for 6 months and they give up. We're actually less efficient than we were before, right? But it takes some stamina, and someone mentioned before, is the leadership of an organization must be behind it because there are going to be growing pains. It's not going to be just everything's going to magically change and be wonderful, okay? It's going to take some time. This is also the reason why I was coming back to at the beginning, which was, this is why you also want to be somewhat adaptive as you introduce Agile into organizations, okay? Some organizations, total support, everybody knows what they're doing, or they're really well set up for it, fine. Realistically, not every organization's like that. You have to do what makes sense. And what makes sense may be trying to key on a couple of things that you drive into the organization, okay, to make it successful, okay? So that they don't give up after 6 months when everything's falling apart. So in Agile, if you look at it, so the way I described it, in every project or feature or whatever it is that you're doing, every pothole that you're filling might be different, okay? But the idea is that you want to basically, when you're finished with the story, you've actually tested it. You want to be pretty clear that it's not going to come back and distract you later, okay? That's the best scenario, okay? Because then the team can move on. Now, remember when we were talking about like reviewing requirements? If you look at this first sprint, right, and you look at it and you say, look at that first slice and you say, am I going to get a decent requirements review at this time? Okay, for one is the scope should be really narrow. It shouldn't take you a month to develop the requirements. Otherwise, this isn't going to work, right? Everybody's head is in the same place at the same time. In fact, most of the developers may have actually already started going off and developing whatever it is that they're developing to meet those requirements, even before the requirements are done, okay? Now, I like to use a term, which I actually think I created, but you can create whatever term you want. I call it napkin requirements, okay? At least for the purposes of when you're working inside a sprint, okay? You don't have to worry about deliverables, okay, that are going to be used by people outside the sprint later in time, okay? So what's important is that the people in the sprint understand exactly what it is that they need to do. So it doesn't matter how you develop those requirements. If you write them on a napkin and everybody says, yep, that's what we're doing, you're good, okay? Now, when you get to the end of the sprint, life is different, okay? Because now you have consumers that are not inside the team, right? They're external. We'll get to that in a second. Okay, so therefore, the requirements, and I guess I'm using that, I'm overloading that term, is different, right? The definition of done is that I have formally documented requirements to whatever the needs are of another team or other people that are outside that team, okay? So, but at least within a story, one of the things that allows you to do these things quickly is you do just what you need to basically deliver the whole story or the whole vertical slice, okay? But that does not let you do, as we talked about earlier, basically go ad hoc, right, whatever software you want, and then just sort of say somebody else's problem. We got the software working, right? No. Okay? Any questions on that? Does that make clear? Okay, and then sprint 2, sprint 3, right? Oh, actually, I meant to point out something else. We're still on the Agile slices for those two locations. Is one of the things you'll notice, I tried to color code these things. In terms of one of the things that, especially when you see like waterfallish models, okay, you tend to develop these requirements for all these things that you want or you think the customer wants, okay? And to some extent, they all have equal priority because you've completed the requirements, you reviewed the requirements, that's what we're going to build. It doesn't really allow you to prioritize the work, okay, in terms of importance to the customers. When you break things up like this into these slices and stories, it actually allows you to say, even though there are all these other things I could do on feature 1, some of those things may be less important than some top characteristics of feature 2. Okay, so from a perspective of what's the best thing to do for the business, because ultimately that's the objective, right? Or one of the main objectives is you're going to say, I'm going to push these things off as lower priority, and I'm going to do these higher priority things on feature 2. Okay. Now, again, within your own organizations, whatever makes sense in terms of slices is what you're going to do. But a fundamental objective is to slice things up as thin as it makes sense, okay, so that you can actually prioritize the slices. Now, slices should stand alone, but they may have dependencies on other things, right? And they're also, one of the things you'll hear is, I can't do that because if I don't deliver all this functionality to the customers, then I got nothing, right? They need all of this. Well, guess what? Usually the requirements don't, people on the phone can't see me, but guess what? This is usually not where they draw the line on the requirements. The line is usually here. And it's all these things that we're talking about that ultimately you want to say, look, these are lower priority. Let's focus on the highest priority slices first. But ultimately, the things that you deliver to the business have to make sense. They have to be, you know, they have to be consumable or sellable to whatever your customer base is. Any questions, comments? Everybody okay with that? Okay. Estimation. Okay, so this is another, I'm still on work in progress. Okay, just in case I lost the thread. estimation. Anybody know how to do estimation, right? What does PMP tell you to do estimate? How does PMP tell you to do estimation, or PMI? WBS. Any other comments? PERT? Okay. Yeah, I actually use WBS as an example. What can you tell me about WBSs? When you look at a WBS like this, because usually you do estimation at the beginning, right? If you're doing it right, you're doing it at the beginning, right? Might refine them later, but you do a WBS. What does that represent? Work, but what are the other two words? No. That's correct, but that's not the answer I was looking for. It reflects work in progress, okay? Because in order to develop that breakdown chart, okay, you actually had to do some work. If it's of any value whatsoever, you had to do work, okay? Now guess what? If you actually had to develop that after you finished the project, okay, and you had hindsight, you could look backwards and say, here's what the WBS really was. And you look at the WBS that you produced at the beginning of the project. And you think it would be, I don't know, 10% different, 80, yeah, and that'd actually probably be a good one. Because for the most part, and some things will be wrong more often than not, they're going to be missing large chunks of things that needed to be done. And the problem is that you've devoted all this WIP, okay, work in progress, and you come up with something that's likely not going to be very useful in terms of estimation. It may be useful in other ways, okay? It may be useful in terms of identifying resources that you need. It may be useful in terms of identifying some tasks. But in general, WBSs really represent a significant amount of WIP that's likely not going to give you the value that you want, at least not for estimation. So if you're doing it to estimate, okay, so just as an example, there are other ways of at least doing the estimation piece, if not things that will actually get you some of the other aspects, like what resources do I need? And a key one is, it's not new, it's been around forever, is analogs, right? You basically look and you say, have I done something that even remotely resembles what I've done before, okay? And from an estimation perspective, which is why you're trying to estimate and figure out what budget you need, how much you need in terms of resources, some other stuff that you need, analogs usually more than fit the bill, okay? Now, one of the processes we use to basically do this is we'll basically take a new development, okay, or a piece of a development, and we'll actually do a walkthrough with the entire team, okay? By the way, one other data point is, anybody know the most effective way of estimating in terms of, is it the people who developed it before, the managers, or someone else who basically is outside the project? Any guesses as to which is the most effective? Boy, you read the book already. Yeah, outside. It turns out that managers, I think, actually came in as the worst. People inside the team weren't all that much better, and actually external basically seem to have the best estimation. But this is actually even better. If you actually have done work that's similar, and you have actually looked at actuals, okay, you know exactly how long it took you before. Now the idea is actually to review what it is that you're being asked to do, that your objective is, okay? And look at pluses and minuses relative to the analog. Like something may have more risk, okay? In which case you're going to add to the estimate, right? Something actually may be simpler, okay? In which case you may detract from the estimate. But in terms of getting a rough order of magnitude estimate, which is really what you're going for usually at this, because you're looking to say how much stuff will fit within whatever it is that you're trying to achieve, okay? Or how expensive is it going to be, analogs tend to be a much better approach. The other thing, which I hinted at a second ago, that analogs give you is all that unexpected work that you did, all the surprises, all the crises that hit that you had to deal with. If you have good data on how much effort you spent on that other feature, even if you didn't break it down as to where it went, okay? That data automatically gets pulled into your new estimate. So now you're not dealing with the sunny view of what it's going to take if everything goes perfectly, because we know how often that occurs, right? So if you have actual data, and again, starting out any project, there aren't that many projects that actually have good actual data, which does create a startup problem. But again, that's an objective, is you'll spend a lot less time doing estimation, you'll put a lot less work in progress out there, and you'll have actually better data, okay? Okay, we're okay with that? You guys are really quiet. Okay, story estimation. Okay, so everybody know what a story is now? Stories are those vertical slices, okay? So Agile and Scrum in particular. I use Agile and Scrum interchangeably, but they actually aren't. Scrum is a method, is a process that fits within the Agile framework. Agile also includes things like in software world, extreme programming, XP, right? And there are practices that are Agile practices like pair programming that are not Scrum, okay? Scrum is more of almost like a project management view of the world, okay? So please forgive me if I use them interchangeably when I really should be saying Scrum as opposed to Agile. But so anyway, in Scrum, okay, there are things called stories, which are those vertical slices, right? And as part of those stories is what you do is as a team, okay? I actually heard a discussion earlier in terms of who comes up with the stories. The idea is anybody can come up with the stories, okay? Ultimately, the team will review the story, okay? And they will agree that, yep, sort of, this is sort of what it will take. The product owner will probably come in and should come in and give the priority, right, in terms of that story, in terms of where it fits on the backlog, that kind of stuff. But ultimately, everything in Agile really is the team owns, okay? So the team owns the story. So one of the key things is when you create a story, the team agrees on what the scope of the story is. By the way, it's not fixed. Like anything else, it's subject to change. Stuff happens. So you get to a story and you say, well, this really, we should do this differently. Really the objective should be this and not really this. And as a team, including the product owner, who's a key stakeholder in the stories, you could agree that the story is different, okay? Or a story may decompose into 5 stories, right? And actually, that's actually a fairly common thing. In fact, that's what you want. Because again, you want to minimize work in progress. So something comes up, it's a big story. The idea is not to break it down then, break it down when you need it, okay? Push the work off to as far off as you can, okay? To minimize the work in progress. Okay, theme here, right? So Scrum Poker, anybody here Scrum Poker? If nothing else, you usually get to chuckle the first time you roll out cards to a team. Okay, and they say, well what happened to the number 9? Well, that's not the way it works. Scrum Poker, the idea is it's set up so that it's really not, it only has a little tiny objective of actually doing estimation. What it's really geared towards is to identify, make sure everybody is in agreement on the scope of the story. They have the same understanding, okay? And also to make sure that, not to make sure, but to basically pull in insights from other people who might have identified something like a risk, okay? Or a piece of work that others hadn't considered, okay? That really makes the story, in their opinion, take twice as long as what everybody else. So what you're really looking for, yes, you're going to use the number, but what you're really looking for is alignment on the numbers. And the difference between 12 and 13, okay, of story points is not a difference, okay? The difference between 5 and 20 is a difference. And that's when you want dialogue. Again, it was brought up earlier, is communication is key, okay? And in this case, with the product owner, their collaboration as well, right? Is you want input. You want the team to communicate and to use their collective knowledge to come up with something that's better than any of them would have had alone. And that's one of the big problems with, if you look at a team, and here's a team leader who basically is, I know the answer and I'm going to give you the answer. It's going to be a lot less effective than if the team comes up with the answer. And I'll go into one other story. Let's see, I'm doing time-wise. So I used to teach a course over at the local university on software process. And one of the things that I used was anybody hear about a survival simulation by human synergistics? No? What's that? What's that? Well, I never saw one on the moon. That would be a good one. Usually the ones I saw were basically you're on a plane, okay, with a bunch of other people. The plane goes down somewhere that you probably never want to go down in, and your objective is survive, right? And they give you this little pamphlet that describes the situation, and it describes all the things that were salvageable from the plane, right? So I saw this one. So what I usually would do with this course is the way to build initially the team and sort of get them working as a team was actually run them through these survival simulations, right? So basically, all these teams would basically be split off. They'd have their little pamphlets. They'd do it individually, and then they'd do it as a team. And I would sit in there and listen as they discussed what was the proper thing to do. Now, of course, no one knows what the proper thing to do because none of the people I was working with actually had any knowledge of survival in these situations. They survived in the corporate world, but and I remember this one team that really stood out, okay, because the situation was the plane went down in the Amazon jungle, okay? So the plane went down under the canopy, okay? So one of the first things you had to decide was a strategy for the team. Do you stay with the plane, okay, and hope that someone finds you, okay, or do you walk? And if you walk, which way do you walk? Because you're in a little mountainous region. It's the rainy season. Do you walk down or do you walk up? Okay, so any suggestions, any thoughts? Stay with the plane. Anybody else? Everybody likes to stay with the plane, right? What's that? Follow a river. Okay, that's a good one. Okay. In the back. Set fire to the canopy. That's a good one, but I don't think they came up with that one. So interestingly enough, the real answer is actually go down to the river and follow it, okay? So, good job. Now, if you were on this team, I don't know your personality. What's that? You would have done that? Good. There was a woman on the team, okay, who actually said pretty much the same thing. But there was someone else on the team who basically took the role of leader, who said, no way, no how, it's the rainy season, where there's going to be a flash flood and we're all going to die. And managed to convince the entire rest of the team, okay, not to do that, and actually not only to not go down to the river, but actually to go uphill, which is, if you're in the Amazon and knew anything about it, which I didn't when I took this, is the absolute wrong thing to do. There's nothing uphill. No one's going to find you. That's it. You're done. Two things happened. One, they went uphill. Two, that woman never said anything else the entire rest of the exercise. Okay? So you're at the very beginning of the exercise and she shut up. Okay? So when I came back at the end and I basically pointed this out to the team, they were like, yeah, she really did make that suggestion. But and it turned out there was a good ending because they actually did much better than they probably would have if we hadn't gone through that exercise as they went through the course. They actually did learn from that, that was a good thing. But it gets to my point, which is for a well-functioning team, there are lots of characteristics, right? What you really want to do is elicit and build on the expertise, the experiences, and the diversity of everybody on the team, okay? This is the key thing of building teams, okay? So story estimation, I was on story estimation, is actually one where you do that, okay? What you want is you want to elicit feedback. You want these people talking. Is if you have someone who's basically leading the discussion and saying, yes, here's what we're doing, A, B, C, and D, and I think it's going to take 13 story points or 13 staff days, depending on your poison. That's not what you want. You really, and the way that Scrum Poker is set up is the idea is everybody has these cards, okay, and they have these funny numbers on them, which are basically supposed to be story points. And what they're going to do is everybody's going to put up their number at the same time. Okay, the idea is that people don't influence each other, okay? Because that creates going back the other way, right? And it doesn't matter that you have some people who really just don't have the expertise to chime in. They'll gain it. They'll learn the expertise. They could actually, when we come down to reconciling the different estimates, say, well, I really didn't know. I took a guess. That's fine, okay? But the idea is ultimately what you're trying to do is elicit input from the entire team. So whatever you can do to do that is helpful in terms of building the team and building the rapport of the team, okay? Everybody okay with that? Any questions, comments? Make sense? Yes, no? Everybody does this, right? Okay. Is there a question back there? Any questions behind me? They're really quiet. Okay, so metrics. Remember what I said about analogs? Okay, one of the things you really do have to do, and people don't like it, especially agile teams, is you really do need to collect some metrics. Actually, the story estimation actually makes it fairly easy to collect metrics because whatever number you finally agree on as a team, that's your estimate. And then what you do is you actually, when you go back and you're reviewing status of these stories, right, to say, here's how we did on the story, you actually collect actuals, okay? And the idea is since you're doing things in rather small chunks and you're doing them very timely, the actuals, they don't have to be precise. But as long as they're within range, and obviously since you're doing things on a fairly frequent schedule every few weeks, the actuals are going to be not too far off. If you get 10, 20%, 30%, you're probably better than you were before. Now you have that data to basically go and do this, right? Which is basically you take all your stories for this particular feature and you sum up the actuals and you say, that's what it took me, right? And you might even do something where you categorize some of the stories in some broad way that might help you also in the future in terms of as you're trying to estimate resources and things like that. It just generates some data, okay? But one of the key things with agile teams is do it as low overhead as possible, okay? The lower the overhead, the better. If they don't even know they're doing it, it's great, okay? Because people don't like it. It's like metrics, oh, well, they're going to game the system. The idea is to make it seem like, one is it doesn't matter, and really it has to not matter. You can't be measuring teams, right? In fact, if you look at story points, one of the big things that they talk about in story points is you never want to compare story points across teams, okay? It only matters that they're consistent within the team, not across teams. But this you turn, and everybody, no. There's a term called velocity, which says how many story points can a team do in a sprint, okay? You look at team A and they can have a velocity of 60. You look at team B and you say that they have a velocity of 48, okay? You sit there and you say, team A is better. Yeah, all of a sudden, the next thing you know, they're going to be gaming the story points on team B. So don't do that, okay? The idea is you're using this within the teams, okay? I'm throwing a lot at you, but please yell if I say too much or get you confused. Okay, so anyway, typical communication paths. Okay, so your business analysts are basically talking to, so let's say you're starting up a development, a feature. Business analysts talk about to one or more architects. They start coming up with some requirements of an architecture for what they're going to do. They start talking with some UI developers and database developers. The UI developers then start talking to the database developers. They all go off and they develop something. They deliver it to a bunch of testers, right? This is a typical communication kind of thing, right? If I could draw silos easily, I probably would have, because it does create a sort of a silo effect, right? You have really good communication usually within those silos. You have really poor communication across the silos, okay? That's just the way it is, right? So if you're organized like this, and not every organization is, you create problems where there are disconnects, right? You create problems where the business analyst didn't really understand that there was going to be some other problem that the UI developer is going to encounter down the line, right? And they're probably not even going to learn that much between the two of them because even the learnings tend to be somewhat siloed, right? The UI team will learn about what went wrong, but in terms of, yeah, go ahead.
Before you get too much further, I wanted to ask you what the actuals were in. Were they also story points?
So, okay, so there's actually two ways that most teams do that. Those actuals, to some extent, I pulled real data, but then I made them up. Sorry, I develop real projects. Those were actually in days. I find that days, staff days, okay? So there are two different ways of doing story points. One of them is actually called story points, which are unit lists, okay? It's not days, it's not weeks, it's not hours, right? They have no units, okay? And the idea is you pick a story and you say, this story is 2 story points. And everything becomes relative to that story, okay? So a 4-story point story is twice as much work as the 2-story point. I chose with the teams that I work with to use days. Does that answer your question?
Yes, answers my question.
Okay.
Thanks.
Go ahead. Okay, I can repeat the question. Question is, why would I choose days over points? Okay, I did it because it was something that was easier for these teams to sort of feel real, okay? Again, I'm working with people who, for the most part, haven't really done Agile before. So for them, I felt that days were actually something that was more easier to deal with, okay? I could have easily gone the other way, but it was just a choice that I made. Is that? Other questions, comments? Okay, okay, so anything else on estimation? Or remember, one of the key things I was also talking about in terms of estimation was also bringing it back to work in progress. Key concept, minimize work in progress. So even estimation is something where you can actually minimize that, okay? But getting into communication, okay, is if you think about it, as I was saying before, in an organization like this, okay, you have really good communication, but it may not be the communication paths that you want, okay? You may have a lot of good communication within the UI teams, within the database teams, and that may be very good, but that may not be what you want to optimize. There's another aspect of this, which is, remember we were talking about specialists, okay, and what happens with the WIP, with the work in progress. This type of communication or organization tends to drive a lot of WIP, okay, because you have handoffs between the teams, right? And those handoffs tend to be WIP, right? The idea in terms of Agile is actually to do things a little bit different. One is, and this is sort of core to a lot of Agile teams, is they're cross-discipline. The idea is figure out who needs to be engaged, okay? And many times they'll preach that the team should stay, this is the team and shall not change. I tend to sort of try to follow that, but I try to change it. I do what makes sense, and sometimes it's better to bring new blood into a team for various reasons because I need a particular expertise that I would like to actually, because of what they're working on. It also helps to propagate across the teams, right? So that the teams themselves don't become islands, right? Because teams do have to communicate. But cross-discipline team, bring your business analysts, bring your UI developers, right? Bring your test engineers all together into a single team, okay? And basically, most of their communication is going to be within each other, within that team. That does not mean that they will not communicate outside the team. But what you're optimizing for is intra-team communication. And the idea with Agile and the fundamental concept is it's strongly connected. So the idea is that everyone knows everything within the team, okay? And one of the reasons why you keep these teams small is so that everybody can know everything, right? All of a sudden, the number of those edges become, right? They grow, what is it, exponentially? They grow really fast as you get a team of 10, 12, 14 people, and a lot of other things don't work when you start getting up to larger teams. Okay, which does create a problem because some projects, it's really hard to generate small teams that actually make sense. And that is a problem. Again, that's why we talk about, I'll introduce a term now, Scrum butt, okay? Anybody hear the term Scrum butt? It's only one T. Okay, that basically says you're not really doing everything by the book. We're doing Scrum, but we're also doing these other things differently. Okay, it's actually a real term. I did not make that one up. But anyway, but the idea is when you get into organizations where it doesn't allow you to have these small teams, you have to sort of then go back to some of the other things. Don't follow the book, right? Try to salvage as much as you can of what makes sense for your organization, rather than saying, yep, can't do Agile. I can't get my team smaller than 10 or 12 people, okay? But coming back to this, okay, we're talking about communication the idea is you have a strongly connected communication paths. Everyone knows everything, okay? The idea being that you're sitting there and one person finds an issue or basically knows of an issue. When someone else is describing, I'm doing this, they basically ask, well, what about this? And all of a sudden it's like that dialogue starts happening, right? And if you keep the team small and well connected in terms of the communication, then you basically have that diversity of experiences all helping the team sort of catch things before they become bigger problems. Another thing that happens in these small groups is frequent reprioritization, okay? So you're within a team and all of a sudden someone runs into a problem where they're stuck, okay? it's immediate. All of a sudden, you basically, as a team, figure out how to get them unstuck, including reprioritize the things that they're working on. They're not waiting until, right, they're finished with something else. Remember that earlier horizontal sliced. So it's very important that this communication be very strongly connected and very frequent, okay? That does not mean that every conversation has 7 people in on it, okay? So this is the concept of stand-ups. When they come into stand-ups, the idea is you have a time where there's one time a day where everybody's in the room at the same time, basically, and stand-ups are really simple, right? And it's very structured in that respect. Okay, what did I just do? Okay, which is, that's okay. What am I doing next is actually one of the most important things. And the third is, what are the issues? Okay, and the idea is this is not status. Okay, this is not a status meeting. There is no multitasking. There's nobody on their phones, okay, and their laptops. They're basically listening to each other, and the thing that makes it work, a couple of things is, one is they have to be short, okay? But here's the trick. They have to be short, but if you go person 1, person 2, person 3, person 4, person 5, 6, 7, and then you're out, that was a failure, okay? You want the interaction. The challenge is, how do you manage these interactions in a way where you don't end up in these long discussions, okay? Which basically make a stand-up that's supposed to be no longer than 15 minutes, take an hour, okay? But also get full value. And I don't have an easy answer, okay? This is one of the reasons why I've actually seen a lot of teams fail. Because guess whose job that is to do that? The Scrum Master, okay? Inexperienced Scrum Masters, one of the things I've seen that will kill a team faster than anything is basically doing things like just rotate Scrum Masters within the team, okay? Basically, you're pretty much assured that most of the time you'll have someone who really doesn't know how to do this, right? You really do want Scrum Masters who really know how to do what they're supposed to be doing. Does anybody know what Scrum Master is supposed to be doing? Facilitate, what else? Servant leader. Has everybody heard the term servant leader? Yeah, everybody knows that. Okay, I won't go into that. Any other things? What's that? Protect the team. Yeah, let me come back to that one too. In terms of how you protect the team, some things that you can do, because you can't protect the team totally. But the idea is exactly as folks have said. The Scrum Master's job is to enable the team to do what they need to do, right? To enable them to focus. It's also to facilitate these discussions. So you want to get that balance of eliciting feedback without it turning into these long conversations. One of the easiest ways to do it is as soon as something crosses that line, okay, it's like, okay, we're taking an issue. Who needs to work the issue? Work it outside, okay? And basically, so you're not ignoring anything, but you basically just identify who's going to work it, but not in the stand-up, okay? So it's a key function of the Scrum Master is to be able to do things like that, and it does take skill, okay? And it's not the same skill that you basically learn when you're learning how to develop a database, okay?
Excuse me, I have a question.
Sure. Go ahead.
My stand-ups on my team, they become status things. Everybody says, I did this yesterday, I'm doing this today, and I have no impediments. And then I think we're having trouble saying, like, I have 10 user stories to do, and I did 2, and I have 8 to go. We're not doing anything like that, so no one really sort of knows what your progress is towards the goal. So do you have any advice on that? Like how to make it not a status meeting?
Right, so you actually said 2 things there. One is the question of how do I make my stand-ups not a status meeting? How do I elicit other people to get engaged? I don't have an easy answer. It's because if no one is, one of the things that I try to do, okay, if I'm being the Scrum Master on a team, is make sure that they're not directing their discussions to me. Okay, what you want to do is make it really clear constantly that the audience for whatever it is that they're describing is the rest of the team and not to me. Okay, that still is it will help avoid a pitfall, but it doesn't necessarily get you to where you want to be, which is if the rest of the team members aren't ready to engage or aren't willing to engage, you got a problem. But the idea is, and it depends on the team, trying to find a way to pull them in. Now, some of the things you can do, and some of the things I found that have worked, is one, I do not go around a room saying, person A go, person B go, person C go. Basically, what I try to do is actually go randomly. Okay, so not every stand-up's the same. Okay, basically go up, 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 and basically sort of make sure that they're paying attention because they can't predict who's going next, right? For one. I'm not saying that's sufficient either, but at least it's a way of actually getting the team engaged. Some other things is actually having to go out and elicit feedback. But again, that's hard to sort of say, well, okay, turn to another person and say, does this impact you or something like that? Without actually being in the situation, it's hard to say what the right answer is. But one thing I will say, there is no single right answer.
One thing, we are going to have, we're not co-located, so that's kind of an issue.
Yeah.
But we're going to try to figure out how to have a Kanban board that everybody could see so that we could physically see this progress we're making as the papers move across the Kanban board. So.
And that is one of the hardest problems. Actually, I think it was the PMP with the PMBOK. Don't they actually give us a statistic on how much communication occurs non-verbally? 90%, was that the number? See how long it was I took my PMP exam. So the problem is when you're colo, that 90% is gone. When you're not colo, sorry, that 90% is gone. You're not getting it, right? The other thing that you're getting when you're non-colo is the multitasking. So of course it's going to turn into, right, if everybody else that's not there is going to be sitting there playing with their phones or doing email or whatever it is, it's really hard. So I know this is not helpful in terms of it's not going to solve your problem, but I think you're keying on the right thing, is anything that you can do to sort of get them more engaged is probably a good thing. Maybe even turn cameras on them. Make it so that they actually have webcams sitting on their PCs and have one of these video conferencing systems so that you can see them as they're sitting there playing with the games. So another question, go ahead.
Team members, have team members, that's right, I can talk pretty loudly. Okay, you also have that problem of communication when you have team members who are on the phone because they are out of the country or widely distributed. And so you have to make those conversations quick also.
You're talking about for the stand-ups, you're talking about for a detailed technical?
It doesn't matter what it is.
Okay. So is there a question in there? It's more a statement. Okay. Yeah, so brevity helps. Yeah, I would agree with that. Is if you can keep, again, I don't care what you do, is if your stand-ups are taking 45 minutes, you're going to lose them. So the more you can do to keep things moving along, but also get the engagement, the better the chance that you'll actually keep them engaged, right? So I agree with you. Now, I do have experience with people who are in other continents and whatever. So I am speaking from experience in terms of it is much more difficult. And I try to pick up cues from what they're saying. I try to surprise them to sort of the people who are remote to sort of see if I can find a way to keep them engaged because they don't know what's coming. And no one likes to be embarrassed. At least most of the people I deal with don't like to be embarrassed. So when they say to repeat the question, yeah, they won't do that too many times. If they do, then you might want to find someone else to join the team. Okay, because and one of the things we do is make it clear, we are not going to be multitasking, okay, during the stand-ups. That is not something we do. Okay, even for the longer ceremonies, like the sprint reviews, no laptops. Okay, because again, you want them engaged. And guess what? It's self-defeating if they start multitasking because the thing that's actually most important to them is to minimize their time and maximize the value in the meeting. So when you have a bunch of people who aren't engaged, what happens to the meeting? It takes longer. So it's, as I said, no easy answers. I won't give you any prescribed answers. All I can tell you is some of the things I've done that have worked, okay, and some of my experiences. Okay, other questions, comments? Let me find the button here. Okay, so everybody know that these are called the pigs, right? Anybody know what pigs are? Oh, come on, more of the people than just one know that this is called pigs. Everybody know where pigs and chickens come from? No, I don't mean that. Go ahead. Now it makes sense, right? The comment was that it is actually the way I heard it told, which is the same thing, is this chicken and this pig were going to start up a restaurant together, and they decided they were going to call it Bacon and Eggs, okay? And the pig goes, no way, I'm committed, you're only contributing or participating. It's really important for this to work that you have people who are committed, okay? Now committed, one of the easiest metrics for commitment is how much time they're spending within the team. In general, you want at least 80% for all your pigs in the team, okay? You want the vast majority of their time focused on the team, because otherwise they're distracted. It's not always possible. Now, one of the things that we did to actually, because distractions are a big issue, right? Stuff happens. Stuff happens that you're not currently working on, that is not part of the current sprint. You could say, oh, make it go away, I'll get to it at the next sprint. Yeah, no. Some of that stuff maybe, but there are a lot of things that actually are time urgent. So what we would do is we would actually have what we call triage. Okay, actually we had another name for it. But the idea is you would designate a person on the team who could be distracted. The idea is that person would deal with the external distractions. That did not mean that that person could single-handedly deal with everything that was coming, that was external to the team. It just meant that this person was triage. Okay, they would deal what they could. They would actually then be able to tap anyone within the team that they needed to resolve the issue, or to at least get it to a point where they can put it on hold until they can draw it into a sprint. Okay, the idea is that the rest of the team stays focused, this person is able to be distracted. And usually the way we would structure the work in the team is this person would be working on things to the extent that we could that were not critical time-wise to everything else that was going on. Because the last thing that you want is everybody depending on something that this person is doing and that person getting distracted. So you'd actually have to structure who you would actually have to deal with the distractions. And that person might change as you go through the different sprints, right? Because the work changes, so what makes sense as to who to tap changes, right? But the idea is that's one way to deal with the distractions, right? I don't remember, did I answer a question? I lost something there. Yes, no? Okay, I lost my train of thought. You can tell me to shut up. Okay, so guess who's not on it? Who's usually not the pigs? Okay, usually you have people who are basically spending 10% of their time on some functionality. They're not pigs, okay? Yeah, I know they want to be pigs. Well, that's a good thing. But they're not the pigs, right? And they need to be treated differently. For example, is like for stand-up. General rule of thumb is anybody can attend a stand-up, but only the pigs speak, okay? Is you don't want someone coming in and basically using it to get the status and then start asking questions. That's going to break down the stand-up really quick. Your 15-minute meeting is going to turn into 45 minutes or an hour, right? So you want these people to sort of stay somewhat, yes, they're open, free communication, transparency. These are great things, and anybody can hear anything, right? Is entitled to know everything, but they are not entitled to derail the team. Yeah, go ahead.
So I had a question about where the PM fits into all of this. So does the PM kind of fall into the chicken category, or no, they're not part of the Scrum team, but just trying to kind of piece that together.
No, that's not necessarily true. So yes, if the PM is all they're going to do is track milestones, then yeah, they'd be a chicken, right? But remember what I said about generalized specialists. The question is, if the PM's only doing PM, then you're right, they're going to be a chicken. There's no two ways about it, right? Because that's probably not contributing to the direct objectives of the team. They're probably not going to be spending 80+% of their time on whatever that team is doing. So yeah, so if you look at it, the PM is likely going to be in this column, the chicken column. Okay, if you can come up with a way where your PM sort of are more engaged, I know, maybe not the easiest thing to do, but.
Right. Well, I think I've seen variations on different projects. In some cases, they play the role of the product owner. In other cases, they work closely with the BA. So it varies by project.
Yep, and that's, so the follow-up on that was, the comment was that, well, I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Situations where the PM actually played multiple roles. One of the other roles that sort of is a natural fit in some cases, or many cases, is product owner. Okay, the person who's going to basically be representing the customer, right, needs into the team. Now, the product owner is sort of a pig, but not really, still sort of a chicken. But it's a more engaged chicken, and it actually has a Scrum name. So, yeah, absolutely. That's certainly anything that you can do to sort of become more engaged is a good thing. But okay.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay.
So we talked about Agile, and we kind of jumped into the development and the Scrum and kind of that area. Talk a little bit about all the other activities that go into the planning. Like we talked about estimating the development work, but how about outside procurement activities? How about stakeholder time? How about all of the other things that go into more traditional project management, and how that ties into, I guess, just to identify one area, estimating the amount of time that the development and the Scrums are going to be dedicating to the work. So how does that fit into all of those other things? Like risk management you mentioned before. I mean, there's a lot of other risks outside of the Scrum development and the user requirements on a project, no?
So, okay, so I'm trying to think out how to answer that, because one is, if we take it piece by piece, because obviously in any organization, there's a lot of roles, right? There's a lot of things that have to get done in order to get a product done or a project done. And I don't think we do have time here to go through all of those. In general, and I'll say in terms of how some of the ways I've found how to deal with that, because some of those people like procurement are specialists. Okay, they are definitely, in most situations, there are exceptions, are not going to be one of the pigs on the team, right? There may be exceptions. But you may have a need as part of whatever you're doing to basically work with procurement. One of the ways I found that actually works best for me is there is someone within the team who owns procurement. That does not mean that they do procurement. They own the interface with that team. Okay, so we have someone who knows everything, who's working with the chicken, okay, but they're doing it so that the quality of what we're getting out of that chicken is good, it's high, because they know exactly what it is that they're expecting. So I found that actually works fairly well with, as long as you have a limited number of these external teams, people, whatever it is that you're working with, is if you can have people within the team own it. Okay, does that help as at least as an approach? Yeah, okay, that's fair. I accept that. Yeah. Okay, got it. Okay, I'm getting the hook. Okay, so let me. Okay, of course, you all now know what the chickens are. Okay, and you also know there are other teams, right? They might be agile teams that also have their own pigs, right? And there obviously needs to be communication, and there are various constructs to deal with them. Scrum or Scrums is one. Agile coaches is another thing. So, but anyway, just because you optimize communication within the team does not mean that there's no communication across teams, okay? And you absolutely have to make sure that that communication occurs, okay? Characteristics, so multidisciplinary, we talked about Scrum, right? Focus, let's see if there's anything new here. Some of the ceremonies, everybody knows that these meetings like stand-ups, sprint reviews, those kinds of things, are all called ceremonies, right? That's just the language. Sprint review and planning, okay. So I'm sure if you've had Agile presentations before, these are the kinds of things that they walk through in agonizing detail. Okay, not agonizing. Okay, so coming back to more of mine is now I'm starting to come back and sort of try to put it back in context, repeat what I've said. Okay, so some of the things in terms of minimizing WIP, okay, work in progress. Napkin requirements is a way, right? Everybody should now be able to see that. The vertical slices, Okay, again, with the vertical slices, you're done with the slice. There's still the possibility that some of the slices that you've done before get thrown away. But in general, you end up throwing a lot less away if you go with these vertical slices than if you've gone to the horizontal specialist just working across the board as fast as they can, right? Communication, stand-up, sprint reviews, and again, it does not mean you don't do pairwise discussions. Collaboration, okay, cross-discipline teams, right? Integration, you can read those slides just as I. Remember triage, right, is a key thing in terms of you want to, as a core thing, as a core principle, you want to help the team maintain focus, okay? They're going to be a lot more effective and productive if they can maintain focus, okay? And alignment within the team, this is really where we're talking about where you reprioritize on the fly, okay? It's not a bad thing to reprioritize, okay? Because the idea is ultimately the objective of what you're optimizing for is the output of the team, not the output of any individual. Okay? And again, now we won't get into it, but performance review systems sort of make that at times hard, right? Because they're looking at individuals. Okay? So, distractions. So I'm coming back to my original list, and I know that there were some others that I hadn't originally put up here. Distractions, right? So we talked about in terms of how you deal with distractions, right? One is things like having triage, right? Another thing is having people focus on the same thing at the same time, focus on just a few things or one thing at a time, and also keeping other things about multitasking out, but I think I get to that. Changes, you see how this sort of deals with changes, though we didn't talk about it a lot, is when you look at those vertical slices, okay, anything that's on the backlog, and again, this comes into the minimizing WIP, right? Anything that's on the backlog is fair game to make it go away. Okay, the less you put into items that are not in the current sprint, the less you have invested as if something changes and they basically become lower priority, right? So that's another reason why, again, we were talking about before, big stories are not a problem unless they're in the sprint, okay? Big stories are okay when you're basically just sticking them on the backlog. They're tracking something. You'll prune them and prioritize them and estimate them later, right? The idea is basically just minimize the WIP, put it on the backlog, let it hang there until you start getting to the point where you're about ready to work on it. But you see how that sort of allows you to deal with change. Because anything that's on the backlog, subject to change, go away without actually costing you a lot, right? Lack of communication, okay, you see how it's structured for communication within the team. This is not a panacea. It does not fix all the communication issues in your organization, okay? In fact, it makes some communication harder, okay? But if you're optimizing for within the team and you're taking an approach like this, that's what you're going to get, right? Multitasking, we've talked about that, don't do it. Specialists, again, we talked a little bit about the generalized specialists, right? And how you actually want to move away from specialists, if at all possible. Okay, so what's the mantra, okay? Anybody tell you, well, you might have looked at the slides already, you probably know the answer. My mantra, do what makes sense, okay? Okay, but what's the biggest obstacle to this? What's the biggest obstacle in terms of rolling this out in your organization? Anybody? Anybody who's even read the slides? Change, okay, but I heard the answer that I used over here. It's trust, okay? That will be the biggest obstacle, is if you trust the people to do, the people that you're empowering, right? Comes down to empowerment. If you trust them to do the right things, okay? All you have to do is sort of point them, give them help, right? The servant leadership. Give them help, okay, in terms of guiding them, but trust them to do the right things. They will do the right things. If you take that power away from them, and I'll give you one more example. I have time for one more example. Okay, if you take that power away, so DeMarco. Everybody know Tom DeMarco? Everybody's heard of him? Oh, okay. So he had this great little book back in the mid-'80s called Peopleware, right? And one of the stories he basically had was of this CEO who was about to do the biggest deal of his company's life. And his lawyer basically comes in, hands him the contract, and what does the CEO do? Opens it up to the last page where he has to sign and starts signing. And the lawyer says, "What are you doing?" He says, "I'm signing it." And he goes, "Why? Don't you want to read it first?" He goes, "No, I trust you." The lawyer picks up the document and runs back to his office. You do that enough times, right? And I'm not saying that's exactly what you want to do, is the people will take ownership for the quality and what they do, rather than saying it's the boss's problem. Okay, it's their ideas. They're telling us what to do. We're just saluting and going, right? So you take that approach, you'll get a lot more out of the teams than the alternative. And with that, I am done, except for questions. Any other questions? Anyone? We still may have a minute.
Do we have questions on the phone? No questions on the phone? How about here in the room?
Thank you.